Can a heart haunted by a grave ever truly open a home to a new life? This is a question the silent dust of the Great Plains answers only in its own time. The train, a roaring beast of iron and steam, belched a final cloud of smoke before pulling away from the lonely platform, leaving Clara standing alone in a stillness that was both deafening and vast. The sun, a brutal eye in a sky of unforgiving blue, beat down on her, and the raw wind whipped at the hem of her simple calico dress, a reminder that she was no longer in the green hills of her youth. Her only companions were a small, worn valise and the oppressive quiet of the town, a quiet more menacing than any angry mob. No one came to greet the bride. The silence was a thick, suffocating thing, a living presence that seemed to stare at her from the empty doorways and shuttered windows of the town's single street. She had traveled across a continent on the promise of a letter, a correspondence courtship that had filled her heart with a fragile, desperate hope for a new life. Away from a past, she had fled. But the reality of this moment, the deafening silence, the judgmental emptiness of the place, was a brutal, physical shock. She had prepared for the physical hardships of the frontier, but she had not prepared for this profound, echoing loneliness. The weight of her decision, the monumental leap of faith, settled on her shoulders like a leaden shroud. She felt a profound sense of dislocation, a searing grief for the life she had left behind, and the bonds of family she had so willingly severed for this chance. Was this the way her new life was meant to begin? Were the promises in the letters nothing more than beautiful lies? Just as a tear began to form in the corner of her eye, a flicker of movement broke the stillness. A small, solemn face, no older than 6, peered from behind the rough-hewn support post of the train station. She was a vision of innocence in a world of dust and grit, with sun-bleached hair and eyes the color of a cool, clear creek. The child was silent, her small hands clutching the rough wood, her gaze fixed on Clara. The girl emerged slowly, taking tentative steps as if approaching a wild animal. Her small feet, clad in worn boots, kicked up tiny puffs of dust with each step. She was a spirit of the frontier, her spirit forged in the hardships of the land and the quiet solitude of her life. The girl's presence was a fragile thread of warmth in the cold, desolate landscape, a moment of profound human connection that began to mend the emotional wound inflicted by her journey. The girl finally stopped a few feet away, her head tilted to the side. She pointed a small, gloved finger at Clara's valise, her gaze moving from the bag to Clara's weary face. "Are you the angel Mama sent?" she asked in a voice as soft as a prairie breeze. Did the words hold a spiritual truth, or was the girl's question merely the innocent fantasy of a lonely child? From the deep shadow cast by the general store's awning, a man stood motionless, watching the scene unfold. His face, weathered by sun and sorrow, was obscured by the wide brim of his hat. He was the cowboy, the father, a figure defined not by a gun, but by a grief that had built a fortress around his heart. He saw his daughter's hopeful approach, her small hand reaching for the stranger, and his breath caught in his throat. The man's body was a monument to his solitude, a testament to a life lived in silent, punishing isolation. His gaze remained fixed on the bride, his expression unreadable, a mixture of resistance and a profound, bone-deep weariness. He had promised himself he would never replace his late wife, and here was the future, a woman from a distant land, a new face for a new life, and he was completely unable to step out of the shadows. The daughter, oblivious to her father's inner turmoil, tugged on the bride's hand with gentle insistence. "Come on," she whispered, her voice full of a child's simple trust. "We'll go home." Would the cowboy let them go? Or would he emerge from the shadows to confront the life his grief had created? The walk through the town was a gauntlet of unspoken judgment. From behind lace curtains and half-open doors, the townspeople watched, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled scorn. The bride knew this silent reception was a culmination of her pre-existing fears, a confirmation of her deepest fear of being an outsider in a world that would never truly accept her. To them, she was not Clara, the woman from the East, but merely the mail-order bride, a caricature of a desperate transaction. She felt the weight of their gaze like a physical burden, a collective memory of the woman she was meant to replace. The town had known his first wife. They had mourned her, and now they silently judged him for bringing a new woman into their world, a living affront to the memory of the dead. It was a suffocating pressure, the feeling of being judged for a crime she didn't know she committed. The daughter, however, was a small, steady source of light. She chattered happily about the town's small wonders, the blacksmith's forge, the smell of fresh-baked bread from the general store, oblivious to the silent hostility that surrounded them. She was a beacon of innocence in a world of passive antagonists. But could that innocence protect them from the truth of what had happened to the woman she was replacing? They finally reached a small, two-story house, a simple structure of rough-hewn wood that sat on a slight rise overlooking a dusty corral. The home was clean but sterile, lacking the personal touch that makes a house a home. The furniture was plain and practical, and there were no photos, no knickknacks, no sign that a woman had ever lived there before. It felt like a stage set, a shell of a home waiting to be filled. A cold sense of dread settled over the bride as the cowboy finally emerged from the barn, his presence as palpable as the setting sun. His boots scuffed the dry earth, and he approached with a slow, deliberate stride. His first words were not a welcome, but a cold, transactional statement. "The arrangements are made," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You'll have a room. The rest is for my daughter." He turned and walked away, a man walled off by an impenetrable grief. Clara stood there, alone in a house that felt emptier than the dusty road she had walked down. What was she to do in this silent, sorrowful home, and what was the true nature of her new husband's broken heart? The first few days were a blur of silent chores and an emotional distance so vast it felt like a physical chasm. The cowboy, whose name she now knew as James, would leave at dawn and return at dusk, exchanging only the most essential words with her. The daughter, Lily, was her only solace, her constant companion and guide to the strange rhythms of the house. One afternoon, while tidying a drawer in the small study, Clara's fingers brushed against something hidden beneath a stack of old ledgers. It was a small, leather-bound book, a worn diary that fell open to a page with a faded ink drawing of a sunflower. The page described the joy of a garden planted in a place where nothing was supposed to grow, a place she now knew as the home's sun-drenched patch of soil. The words were a window into the soul of the woman who had lived there, a testament to her quiet resilience and her ability to find beauty in the unyielding frontier. Clara felt a pang of profound empathy for this woman whose life she was now inhabiting. As she closed the book, a small silver locket slipped from between the pages, its clasp broken and its surface tarnished. She held it in her hand, feeling the chill of the metal, and knew she was holding a physical remnant of the ghost she had been trying to ignore. What had happened to this brave, resilient woman? The diary was silent on the end of her story, ending with the joyful flourish of a new garden plan. Was the true story of the late wife a secret the cowboy was protecting her from? The town's silent judgment gave way to a subtle but more menacing form of interference. An elderly woman, Mrs. Gable, a gaunt figure with a face like a dried apple, appeared at the front door under the pretense of delivering a pie. Her eyes, sharp and judgmental, surveyed the house and Clara's every move. She made a point of sighing heavily whenever she passed the unplanted garden, as if mourning a loss that only she could truly feel. "Some folks have a place here," she said, her voice a low, passive-aggressive hum. "Others, well, they're just passing through." The old woman's visit was no act of kindness. It was a cold, unspoken threat. She hinted at the late wife's popularity, at the love she had shared with James, a bond so deep it could never be replaced. She spoke of a community-wide debt to the deceased woman, a promise to honor her memory by keeping her spirit alive in the town, a subtle but clear warning to Clara that she was not welcome. The ghost of the late wife was now not just a presence in the house, but a collective force of resistance from the town. As Mrs. Gable left, she paused on the porch, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Some say her spirit still wanders this land," she said, her eyes fixed on Clara's, "waiting to be set free. I wonder who will be the one to finally do it." Clara's blood ran cold. Was the old woman implying that the late wife's death was not an accident at all? That night, Lily awoke with a scream, thrashing in her bed. Clara rushed in to find the girl tangled in her blankets, her face pale and streaked with tears. James was there in a flash, his grief-stricken fortress crumbling in the face of his daughter's pain. Lily's nightmare was always the same, a rushing sound, a flash of something silver, and her mother's voice calling her name from a great distance. It was a terrifying glimpse into the trauma that haunted her. As James held his daughter, Clara saw a rare glimpse of his raw, unshielded pain. He murmured soft, heartbroken words into Lily's hair, words of reassurance and sorrow. He blamed himself. He had been so consumed by his work, by the need to provide, that he had not been there in the final moments of his wife's life. He had been in the barn mending a saddle when the sound had cut through the quiet of the ranch, a sound he had spent every day since trying to forget. The air in the room was thick with his self-blame, a grief that had been stewing in silent solitude for far too long. He looked at the floor, his eyes filled with a fresh wave of despair. "It wasn't a sudden accident," he finally said, his voice a broken rasp. "I should have been with her. I shouldn't have been so far away." What was the sudden accident? The full truth of the tragedy was still a secret, and now it was a physical presence in the room. The first plot twist arrived not as a sudden confrontation, but as a slow, creeping inevitability. The summer sun, which had been a harsh companion, turned into a merciless enemy. The well, the lifeblood of the ranch, began to run dry. The grasses of the pasture turned from gold to brown, and the cattle, lean and desperate, huddled in the shade of the fence line. James, a man whose identity was tied to the land, watched his livelihood slowly wither and die. The financial pressure was a ticking clock, a deadline that added a new kind of urgency to their fragile household. James was physically and emotionally exhausted, a man who had fought a losing battle against his grief and was now fighting a losing battle against nature itself. His solitary struggle was proving to be unsustainable. One evening, he sat on the porch, staring out at the dying land, and his despair was a tangible thing. He spoke not to Clara, but to the fading light. "This land is cursed," he said, his voice filled with a desperate resignation. "It's taken everything from me, and now it's taking the rest." He truly believed he was fighting a supernatural evil. What if there was more than just bad luck at play? What if the curse was real? Clara, a woman of unexpected ingenuity, had been observing James's despair and the dying land. She had noticed the small, withered plants on the edge of the property, hardy native grasses that had survived the drought. While her life in the East had been sheltered, her own secret past had taught her to be resourceful and to find opportunity where others saw only ruin. One morning, she approached James with a plan. She proposed they use the drought-resistant grasses to create a new pasture, to trade her skills for his knowledge of the land. Her suggestion, born of pure resilience, was met with a grim silence. The tension in the air was palpable as James looked at her, his eyes finally, truly seeing her, not as a replacement, but as a person with her own strengths. Lily, watching from the kitchen, offered her support. "Mama sent a gardener to make things grow," she said, her voice full of a child's unwavering faith. The daughter's simple words were a final push, a testament to her belief in Clara that her father could no longer ignore. Reluctantly, with a hint of something that resembled hope in his eyes, James agreed to the plan. He had to accept help, not just to save his land, but to save his family. For the first time, he was inviting the future into his present. Would this act of collaboration be enough to save them? And what role did the town play in this desperate game? Just as hope began to take root on the parched land, a new, unforeseen calamity struck. The small pond, a vital watering hole for the cattle, was mysteriously poisoned, and the water was fouled beyond use. The land was not just dying, it was under attack. The sabotage was cruel and targeted, a direct blow to the heart of Clara's plan and James's last hope. Clara knew instinctively it was not a random act of nature. It was an act of malice. The town's passive antagonism had finally blossomed into open aggression. The town elder, Mrs. Gable, with her sharp eyes and sharper words, saw Clara's plan not as a solution, but as an affront to the memory of the dead wife and a betrayal of the community. To her and others, Clara was an interloper who threatened to erase the past. They had chosen to fight for the memory of the ghost, and they were willing to destroy the living to do it. The family was in more danger than ever before. The threat was not a distant storm, but a quiet, insidious evil hiding in plain sight. They had been forced to rely on the land, but now they were forced to confront the secrets of the community itself. Who had done this, and what were they willing to do to stop them from succeeding? The sight of the poisoned pond and the suffering cattle finally broke James's silence. He looked at Clara, and for the first time, his expression was not of grief, but of a white-hot rage that was not directed at her, but at his town. He knew who was responsible. He stormed into town, a man no longer defined by sorrow, but by a righteous fury, and demanded to know why they were trying to ruin his family and his life. He confronted Mrs. Gable in the middle of the street, and his words, usually so guarded, now flowed freely, filled with accusations and a demand for the truth. Mrs. Gable, a woman who had spent her life shrouded in silent judgment, finally snapped. She spat out the truth, a vile, long-held secret that had poisoned the town as surely as the pond. "We were protecting her," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "We saw what you were doing to her, pushing her into a life she didn't want." The town, she revealed, had been trying to get James's late wife to leave him, to escape the suffocating loneliness of his grief. They blamed James for her death, and they saw Clara as the next victim of his emotional neglect. The town's long-held secret was now out in the open, a shocking plot twist that reframed the entire story. James's grief was not just a reaction to a tragic death, but a consequence of a secret he had been carrying for years, a truth the town had been holding over his head and his emotional paralysis for a long time. What was the truth of the late wife's death? Was the ghost Clara was fighting a malevolent entity or a protector? The true nature of the tragedy was finally revealed. James's late wife was not the resilient pioneer he had convinced himself she was, but a troubled soul who had been deeply unhappy on the frontier. She had not found peace in the solitude of the land, but had been consumed by a searing loneliness. Her accident had not been a random act of fate, but a desperate, failed attempt to run away. He had found her body at the bottom of a ravine, a fall she took while trying to escape the confines of her life. He had spent every day since her death living in a grief-stricken prison of his own making, a punishment he believed he deserved. The town, in its own misguided way, had seen her unhappiness and had tried to help her escape, not knowing her desperation. They had been protecting what they saw as her memory, not knowing that their passive judgment was only adding to James's suffering. The town's judgment and his grief were a self-inflicted wound, a cycle of sorrow that had nearly destroyed them all. The ghost Clara had been fighting was a beautiful but tragic lie. The past was a bitter, painful truth. But it was a truth they could finally face together. James looked at Clara with a newfound humility, his eyes filled with a gratitude that transcended words. He had been so consumed by his guilt that he had not seen the true gift in front of him, a second chance. Would this truth be enough to set them free and allow them to build a new life together? The very next day, as James began to clear the poisoned pond, Lily approached Clara, her small hands clutching a handful of wildflowers. Her eyes, filled with a wisdom that seemed to transcend her years, held a hint of a memory. "Mama was sad," she said, her voice soft but clear. "She told me she couldn't fly." Clara's heart ached, recognizing the echo of her own past traumas in the girl's words. Lily's voice took on a dreamlike quality, as if she were speaking of a place only she could see. "Then a big wind came. It was cold," she said, her voice a whisper, "and a bright light flew down to her, like a star. The star flew away, and then Mama told me she wasn't sad anymore. She was free." Lily then pointed to Clara. "The star told me she was going to find us. She told me to wait for her. Are you the star?" The daughter's words were a revelation, a profound plot twist that reframed the story not as a tragic tale of two women, but as a spiritual saga of a fated reunion. The ghost was not a malevolent presence, but a guardian angel, a spiritual guide that had led Clara to them. The late wife, in her final moments, had released her suffering and had sent a light to guide a new life to her family. The daughter, in her innocence, had been the only one with the faith to see it. What could James possibly say to a revelation as profound as this? James, who had been listening from a distance, walked toward them, his steps no longer burdened by the weight of his grief. He looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a powerful, soul-shaking understanding. He no longer saw her as a mail-order bride or a replacement for his late wife. He saw her as a gift, a promise of a future sent to him when he had been too lost in his sorrow to ask for it. He took her hands in his touch gentle and sure, and spoke words that were not transactional, but from the heart. He confessed his guilt, his pain, and his gratitude. He spoke of his love for Lily and the fear he had felt that he could never truly be a father to her, not without a mother to guide him. He thanked her for her quiet resilience, her unexpected courage, and for being the one person who had not judged him, but had shown him a new path. It was a promise of a future built on truth and forgiveness, a new beginning for a man who had been defined by his end. He then offered her a new life, not as his wife, but as his partner, as the co-parent of his daughter. The words were a quiet, powerful testament to his transformation. He had finally surrendered his grief to the promise of a new life. He was no longer the cowboy of sorrow, but a man ready to fight for his family. But was Clara ready to accept such a complicated promise? Just as James spoke his heartfelt promise, the long-brewing external conflict finally exploded. The poisoned pond was not the end of the town's sabotage, but the beginning. A small posse of townspeople, led by Mrs. Gable, rode toward the ranch, their faces grim and their intentions clear. They had come to run Clara off the land, to protect the memory of the dead wife, and end what they saw as a desecration of the past. The stage was set for a confrontation, not a gunfight, but a standoff between past and future. The small, quiet town that had once been a passive antagonist was now a living, breathing threat. They were a collective force of judgment and resentment, a mob fueled by their own grief and an almost spiritual loyalty to the late wife. James stood in front of Clara and Lily, his body a shield against the town's hostility. He had to stand and fight, not just for his family, but for his right to a new life, free from the past. The air was thick with tension. The only sound was the thud of the horses' hooves and the low, menacing hum of the mob. James drew his gun, but not to fight. He fired a warning shot into the air, a final, desperate plea. Would the town back down, or would they continue their crusade against a man who had finally found a reason to live? The town, faced with James's defiant stand, wavered for a moment. But before they could act, Clara stepped forward, her hands outstretched in a gesture of peace. She spoke not to the mob's anger, but to their grief. She spoke of the late wife's hidden sorrow, the loneliness that had consumed her, and the pain James had been carrying in silence for so long. She told them that the ghost they were fighting for was no longer a ghost of sorrow, but a guardian angel, a spirit who wanted her family to be happy. She spoke of Lily's innocent vision, of the star that had guided her to this lonely place, and of the peace that had finally come to the home. Her words, delivered with a quiet strength that transcended the mob's fury, were a revelation. Mrs. Gable, hearing the truth of her late friend's suffering, looked at James and saw not a man who had moved on, but a man who had been living in a purgatory of guilt and silence. Her face crumpled with a mixture of shame and regret, and she finally turned her horse and rode away. The rest of the mob followed, their crusade against a new family now an act of shame. The town had finally found its redemption. They had been a passive antagonist, but now they had chosen to become a community once more. The ghost of the past had finally been laid to rest. What was left to do but build a new future? With the town's judgment finally quieted, a new chapter began for James, Clara, and Lily. The townspeople, humbled by their actions, began to offer their support, not out of judgment, but out of a genuine desire to help. They brought food and water, mended fences, and worked together to clean the fouled pond. The home, once a silent shell, began to fill with the sounds of laughter and life. One evening, as the sun set over the now green pastures, James and Clara stood on the porch. He took her hand, his touch no longer tentative but filled with a quiet confidence. He pulled a small silver locket from his pocket, the same one Clara had found in the late wife's diary. But now it was mended and polished, a small testament to his willingness to heal the past. "I was wrong," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was a man so broken by my past that I couldn't see the future that was standing right in front of me." He opened the locket, and inside, on one side, was a tiny, faded picture of his late wife. On the other side was a picture of a sunflower, a symbol of the garden she had planted, a testament to her quiet resilience. "This isn't a replacement," he said, holding the locket in his hand. "This is a promise. Will you marry me? Not as a contract, but as a family?" The question hung in the air, a new kind of silence filled with a terrifying, exhilarating hope. What would she say to a man who had finally opened his heart? Clara's answer was a whispered, "Yes," and a new kind of light filled the home. The story of James, Clara, and Lily was now a tale of a family, not one of convenience, but one of spiritual fate and profound, earned love. The town, which had been so quick to judge, now celebrated the union, their own redemption tied to the new life that had taken root among them. The ghost of the past was finally laid to rest, not in a grave, but in the heart of a new family. As the sun set, a new narration began, not from a narrator, but from a whisper carried on the wind. It was the voice of James's late wife, the true angel of the story. She spoke of her journey, of her own deep-seated sorrow and the peace she had finally found. She narrated her final moments not of desperation, but of her spirit leaving her body and becoming a star, a light in the endless cosmic dance. She spoke of her promise to her daughter, of her mission to guide a new soul to her family. "I am the angel Mama sent," the whisper said, a final beautiful revelation. "And I am finally at peace, for they are a family now, a new kind of family, and my spirit is home." The voice faded, leaving only the quiet wind. Had she truly found peace in her family's newfound happiness? A year passed. The land, once barren and poisoned, was now alive and green. a testament to Clara's knowledge and James's hard work. The house was no longer a silent shell, but a vibrant home filled with the smell of fresh-baked bread, the sound of laughter, and the warmth of a family that had been forged in the crucible of loss and hope. James was no longer a man defined by his grief, but a man made whole by love. Lily was no longer a sad child, but a beacon of joy, her faith in angels and stars a symbol of the spiritual truth that had brought her family together. The town, once a collection of lonely, judgmental people, was now a true community. Their mutual support and kindness, a testament to the power of a single act of courage and a willingness to forgive. The story of the mail-order bride and the grieving cowboy became a legend, a folk tale of a new beginning. They had not replaced the past, but had honored it by creating a new future. On a warm afternoon, James, Clara, and Lily stood on the porch, watching the sun set over the endless, sweeping vista of the Great Plains. The family, together and at peace, watched the stars begin to appear, a silent promise of a new day. Could any challenge, a drought, a bad harvest, or even another family secret ever break a bond so strong?